Today, however, was not just about finding inspiration, it was about escape. The clutter of city life, the constant buzz of his phone, and deadlines had begun to wear him down. He needed the stillness of the woods, a place where stories seemed to seep from the very ground. His destination was a little-known trail he'd heard about from a local cafe owner in the nearby town. "It's not on any of the maps," the owner had said, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "but it's there if you know where to look. Follow the river until you see the cedar with the split trunk, then head straight into the thicket." That's the early morning mist clung to the dense canopy of the Pacific Northwest forest as Ethan Wright laced up his hiking boots. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and pine. As a freelance writer, Ethan often sought solitude in nature, hoping the quiet would inspire his next horror story. Ere the old woods begin. Intrigued by the mystery, Ethan had set out at dawn. He walked beside the river, the sound of water rushing over rocks a constant companion. As he walked, he noticed how the light filtered through the trees, casting intricate shadows that danced on the forest floor. When he finally found the cedar with the split trunk, it felt like stepping through a doorway into another world. The trees here were older, their trunks wider, and the canopy denser. A thin layer of fog hung about the underbrush, softening the edges of the world. Ethan pushed deeper into the forest, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and the natural apprehension that came from venturing into unknown territory. As he moved, he brushed past ferns and thick undergrowth, his steps muffled by the thick carpet of needles beneath his feet. It was here, in a clearing surrounded by towering hemlocks and Douglas firs, that Ethan noticed something unusual. Partially obscured by moss and the detritus of the forest, a small notebook lay nestled between the gnarled roots of an ancient cedar. It was as if the tree itself was presenting him with a gift, or a warning. The cover of the notebook was leather, worn and weathered by time and elements, its edges curled and frayed. Ethan knelt down, his curiosity piqued, and gently lifted the notebook. It felt heavy in his hands, laden with secrets. He opened it to the first page, the leather creaking slightly. The handwriting inside was erratic, as though written in haste. It began with an introduction by someone named James Monroe, who had ventured into these same woods in the early 1900s. James wrote of his escape from the clamor of modern life, much like Ethan, but his tone soon turned from one of awe to apprehension and fear. As Ethan flipped through the pages, the entries detailed James's growing sense of unease, his descriptions of strange noises in the night, of being watched from the shadows. The forest around Ethan seemed to close in as he read, the whispers of the wind mirroring the whispers of the past captured on the pages. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the distance, now carried a weight of ominous possibility. Lost in the story, Ethan didn't notice the sun beginning to set, the light dimming around him, shadows lengthening. He was alone, far from the beaten path, holding what appeared to be the diary of a man who might never have left these woods. A chill ran down his spine as he considered the possibility that the story he had been looking for was not one to be written, but one to be lived. With a resolve fortified by both fear and intrigue, Ethan tucked the notebook into his backpack. The forest no longer felt serene or welcoming. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a world that was darker and more mysterious than he had ever imagined. As he made his way back toward the trail, the fading light seemed to whisper secrets just beyond his understanding, urging him to delve deeper into the tale of James Monroe and the shadows that haunted these ancient woods. Ethan sat under the protective cover of an aged fir tree as the first drops of a late afternoon rain began to fall. He opened the aged notebook once again, the pages stiff with the dampness that clung to everything in this dense, misty forest. The handwriting of James Monroe wavered across the page, sometimes spilling out in rushed, barely legible scrawls that spoke of a mind increasingly consumed by fear and confusion. James had begun his account in a hopeful tone, detailing his escape from the relentless pace of industrial America to seek solitude in the unspoiled wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. His initial entries were filled with lyrical descriptions of the majestic beauty surrounding him, towering cedars and Douglas firs, clear streams teeming with fish, and the endless chorus of birdsong that filled the air. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted dramatically. It started subtly, with James noting an unease that crept upon him during the nights. He wrote of a pervasive silence that descended after dusk, so deep and complete that it felt almost oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the sounds that broke the stillness, twigs snapping with no wind to stir them, rustlings in the underbrush that suggested the presence of something, or someone, watching from the darkness. With each entry, James's descriptions grew more alarmed. He told of shadows that moved against the natural sway of trees, lingering at the edge of his campsite. He sketched rough images in the margins, shadowy figures with elongated limbs that didn't seem entirely human. His sleep became troubled, filled with nightmares of being chased through the underbrush by unseen entities. One particularly chilling entry described a night when the moon was full and the forest was awash in a ghostly light. James had awoken to the sensation of being watched and, peering out from his tent, saw figures at the periphery of the clearing. They were motionless, silhouetted against the moonlight, their forms blurry and indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. James wrote that he dared not move or speak, fearing what these figures might do if they realized he could see them. He lay in silence until the first light of dawn, and when he looked again, they were gone. As the days passed, James's writings became a mix of frantic fear and desperate fascination. He speculated about the nature of the beings he encountered, wondering if they were spirits of the forest or something darker, something ancient that had existed long before the first settlers had come to these lands. The notebook took a darker turn as James delved into attempts to communicate with these entities. He described setting up circles of stones and other symbols he found in folklore books, hoping to either ward off evil or attract benevolent spirits that could offer protection. One entry was nothing more than a series of hastily drawn symbols, their meanings unclear, but their desperation palpable. Ethan read these accounts with a growing sense of dread. The forest around him, once merely a setting for a day's escape, now seemed imbued with a sinister presence. Could the same forces that tormented James Monroe over a century ago still linger in these woods? The thought was both terrifying and irresistibly compelling. He knew that rationality should prevail, that there were logical explanations for everything James had experienced. Isolation could play tricks on the mind, animals, or even other humans could have wandered close to his camp. Yet the fear that clutched at his heart was not easily swayed by logic. He felt a deep, unnerving connection to James Monroe, as if by reading the notebook, he had stirred something that had been waiting to be awakened. As night began to fall, Ethan realized he needed to make a decision. He could head back to the safety of the town, leaving the mysteries of the notebook, and the forest, behind. Or he could stay, delving deeper into James's world, perhaps finding answers to questions that had plagued him since he first opened the weathered pages. With a deep breath, he packed up his belongings, the notebook safely tucked away in his backpack, and set off deeper into the woods, driven by a need to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. Ethan's decision to venture deeper into the forest as dusk approached brought a palpable shift in the atmosphere around him. The usual evening chorus of birds gradually faded into a tense silence, and even the gentle rustling of leaves seemed to carry a cautionary note. With only the narrow beam of his flashlight piercing the encroaching darkness, Ethan felt a growing unease, the weight of the unknown pressing against his resolve. The notebook, now a constant companion, seemed to throb with a life of its own against his side. He stopped to read under the faint glow of his headlamp, turning to the pages where James Monroe described his first encounter with what he called the Hollow Ones. According to James, these beings were neither ghost nor creature, they existed in the shadows, their forms barely discernible and their faces voids of absolute darkness. Their presence was often preceded by a drop in temperature and a peculiar scent of decay, a sign that the normal rules of the living world no longer applied. As he read, Ethan's surroundings began to mirror the haunting descriptions on the page. A cold draft swept through the trees, carrying with it a musty, earthy smell that made him shiver. He quickened his pace, the sounds of his footsteps unnervingly loud in the silent forest. James's notes became more erratic after his first few encounters with the Hollow Ones. He wrote of seeing them more frequently, always at the edge of his vision, disappearing when he tried to focus on them directly. He described how they seemed to communicate, a low, murmuring chant that seemed almost like a lament. The words were indecipherable but carried an emotional weight that left him feeling drained and inexplicably sorrowful. The further Ethan walked, the more he felt as if he were stepping through the pages of the notebook, each footfall echoing a line of James's story. He noticed subtle movements in the dark, quick shifts in the underbrush, as if something was skirting the edge of his light. When he finally paused, catching his breath, he listened and could just make out a faint whispering, like the sound of dry leaves being stirred by a gentle breeze. It was unintelligible, yet he felt an urge to understand, to listen closer. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Ethan found a small clearing and decided to set up camp for the night. As he unpacked his gear, his hands trembled slightly, the stories from the notebook swirling in his mind. He remembered James's attempts to communicate with the Hollow Ones and, in a moment of reckless daring, decided to replicate one of the protective circles James had described. Using stones and twigs, he arranged them in a pattern on the forest floor, hoping it might ward off any unwelcome visitors during the night. Once his tent was set up and the circle was complete, Ethan sat with his back against a tree, the notebook open on his lap. He tried to make sense of James's scribbled notes about the symbols, wondering if they held any real power or if they were merely the product of a frightened mind. As night deepened, the forest seemed to close in around him. The air grew colder, and the faint whispering became a constant backdrop, more distinct now in the darkness. Ethan strained to decipher the sounds, the words seeming almost familiar, as if he were on the verge of understanding. Then, abruptly, the whispering stopped. The silence was complete, oppressive. Ethan held his breath, listening intently. A chill ran down his spine as he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly, he raised his flashlight and turned it towards the edge of the clearing. There, just beyond the circle of light, were the Hollow Ones. Their forms were indistinct, shimmering slightly as if made of smoke. Their faces were voids, darker than the night itself, absorbing all light. Ethan felt a deep, primal fear rise within him, but he could not move, could not look away. The Hollow Ones stood motionless, watching him. Then, as if on a silent cue, they began to move closer, their forms gliding effortlessly over the forest floor. Ethan's mind raced. Had he misread the symbols? Had he inadvertently invited them closer? In a desperate bid for clarity, he flipped through the notebook, looking for anything he might have missed. But his hands shook too much to focus on the text. As the figures drew nearer, the temperature dropped further, and the smell of decay grew overwhelming. Ethan's last thought before the darkness enveloped him was a frantic hope that he had misunderstood the nature of the Hollow Ones, that perhaps they were not harbingers of doom but of some twisted form of salvation. The next morning, the forest was calm, the air fresh with the scent of pine and earth. Ethan's tent stood empty, the notebook lying open on the ground, its pages fluttering gently in the breeze. The circle of stones and twigs remained undisturbed, the only evidence of the night's encounter. Ethan Wright, like James Monroe before him, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his written account, a chilling testament to the mysteries of the forest and the shadows that dwell within it. The disappearance of Ethan Wright was not immediately noticed. It was not uncommon for him to spend days, sometimes even weeks, in isolation, working on his writings. However, as days turned into weeks with no word, his friends began to worry. His last known location was a small cafe in a quaint town near the forest, where he had mentioned his plans to explore an uncharted area. Concerned, his friends reported him missing. The local police conducted a search but found only his car parked near an old trailhead that led deep into the forest. No sign of Ethan or his camping gear was discovered. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The search was eventually called off, chalked up to another unsolved mystery of the vast wilderness. Meanwhile, Ethan's older sister, Mia, a librarian with a keen interest in local history and folklore, refused to give up so easily. She began her investigation by tracking down the last few people who had seen Ethan, including the cafe owner who had told him about the hidden trail. She gathered all of Ethan's notes and belongings that had been recovered from his car, but one item was conspicuously missing: the mysterious notebook he had found. Determined to uncover more clues, Mia dove into the historical archives of the nearest town library, looking for any mention of James Monroe, the previous owner of the notebook, or any similar disappearances. Hours turned into days as she sifted through old newspaper clippings, land deeds, and personal journals from settlers of the region. Her breakthrough came when she stumbled upon an old map tucked away in a forgotten drawer. The map was dated back to the early 1900s and marked an area of the forest with a warning in faded ink: "Beware the hollow grounds." Intrigued and slightly unnerved, Mia cross-referenced the map with modern satellite images, discovering that the marked area overlapped significantly with where Ethan had planned to explore. Her research took a darker turn as she delved into folklore surrounding the region. Stories of the Hollow Ones, spirits of the forest that were both revered and feared by local tribes, surfaced repeatedly in her findings. According to legend, these spirits protected the forest and punished those who trespassed with ill intent. Realizing the potential danger her brother might have been in, Mia reached out to local experts in folklore and paranormal phenomena. Dr. Harold Green, an anthropologist known for his studies on indigenous myths, became particularly interested in her story. After hearing about the Hollow Ones, he suggested that Ethan's and James Monroe's experiences might be linked to a forgotten ritualistic boundary known to the local tribes as a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Armed with new information, Mia and Dr. Green organized a new search party, this time focusing on the area marked on the old map. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew heavy, and a mist seemed to roll in from nowhere, enveloping them in a cold, damp embrace. The team used GPS to ensure they stayed within the safe bounds that Mia had mapped out, but even so, the feeling of being watched was palpable. It was Dr. Green who first noticed a pattern on the ground, partially obscured by fallen leaves and moss. It was a large circle, made up of stones and old bones, with symbols that resembled those described in James Monroe's frantic notes. Mia felt a chill run down her spine as she realized they had found the site where Ethan likely spent his last night. The team set up camp near the circle, planning to document the site at dawn. That night, the forest was unnervingly quiet. Mia lay awake in her tent, clutching a copy of the map and a flashlight. Every small sound seemed amplified. Just as she began to drift off to sleep, a low, mournful chant filled the air, echoing through the trees. It was unlike anything she had ever heard, a sound that seemed both ancient and otherworldly. Grabbing her flashlight, Mia stepped out of her tent. The others in the camp were already awake, gathered around the stone circle, looking bewildered and scared. The chanting grew louder, a sad, haunting melody that seemed to speak directly to Mia. She approached the circle cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the edge of the circle, the ground beneath her feet felt unnaturally cold. The air shimmered slightly, as if she was looking through water. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it made her ears ring. Mia looked around at the fearful faces of the search party, realizing they were standing at the threshold of something inexplicable. The next morning, the team found several items buried beneath the moss inside the circle: an old leather notebook, Ethan's watch, and a camera with its last picture showing a blurred image of shadowy figures standing in the darkness. The evidence was unsettling, but for Mia, it was a sign that Ethan had indeed found something extraordinary, something that blurred the lines between myth and reality. Now, with the notebook in her possession and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her brother's disappearance, Mia knew that her quest was far from over. She needed to understand the forces at play, to uncover the truth hidden within the ancient forest, and hopefully, in doing so, find a way to bring Ethan back. Mia stood at the edge of the clearing, holding the old leather notebook tightly against her chest. The morning mist had settled low among the trees, giving the forest a spectral, otherworldly appearance. With each breath of the crisp, damp air, she felt as though she was inhaling the ancient secrets of the woods. Today marked 1 year since Ethan's disappearance, and she was back at the same spot, determined to uncover more about the mysterious forces that had taken her brother. After the chilling discoveries of the previous search, Mia had spent months poring over the contents of the notebook and consulting with experts on paranormal phenomena and indigenous folklore. She learned that the symbols found at the site were part of a ritual believed to protect against or communicate with the Hollow Ones, entities that were both feared and revered by the local tribes. Equipped with this new knowledge, Mia had organized a more extensive expedition. Joined by Dr. Green, 2 experienced guides, and a team equipped with various scientific instruments, she hoped to capture evidence of the phenomena Ethan had described. The group was also accompanied by a medium, Clara, who claimed to have the ability to communicate with spirits. As they entered the heart of the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the normal sounds of wildlife faded into silence. The team set up their base camp in a wide clearing not far from the ritual site. Equipment was unpacked, thermal cameras, EMF meters, audio recorders, all set up with the hope of detecting something beyond the scope of normal understanding. That night, under a blanket of stars, Mia and the team gathered around the stone circle. Clara, the medium, sat at the center, her eyes closed and her hands extended towards the stones. The rest of the team held their breath, watching and waiting. Slowly, Clara began to speak, her voice trembling slightly. "The woods are alive," she whispered. "They remember all who walk their paths. Some are welcomed, some are taken." The temperature dropped sharply, and the EMF meters began to spike erratically. Mia felt a chill run down her spine as Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "They are here, the Hollow Ones. They watch us from the shadows. They are curious about your lights and machines. They are drawn to your energy." The thermal cameras picked up fluctuating temperatures around the circle, and the audio recorders captured a low, indistinct murmur, similar to what Mia had heard the previous year. The team watched in awe and horror as the air around the circle seemed to shimmer, distorting slightly as if heat was rising from the ground. Suddenly, Clara's body stiffened, and her face contorted in pain. "They are angry," she gasped. "We are intruding, trespassing." Mia stepped forward, her resolve firm. "We come in peace," she said loudly, addressing the unseen entities. "We seek understanding, not to invade or disrupt. We want to learn about you, to communicate." The shimmering air grew more intense, and a faint whisper filled the clearing, echoing strangely as if coming from a great distance. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, a deep, resonant sadness that seemed to permeate the very air. For several minutes, the phenomena continued, growing in intensity. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ceased. The temperature normalized, and the equipment quieted. Clara slumped forward, exhausted and pale. The team spent the rest of the night analyzing the recordings, the images, and the readings they had captured. They had experienced something extraordinary, something unexplainable by conventional science. Mia felt a mix of triumph and trepidation. They had reached out to whatever resided in these woods, and it had responded. As dawn broke over the forest, Mia walked alone to the spot where Ethan's belongings had been found. She knelt down, placing her hand on the cold, damp earth. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm here. I'm trying to understand, to find a way to reach you." Tears mingled with the morning dew on her cheeks as she stood and looked around at the peaceful forest. It no longer seemed malevolent but rather filled with a profound sadness. Mia knew her search was not over, it might never be. But she had made contact, crossed a bridge into the unknown, and for now, that would have to be enough. Determined to return, to continue her efforts to understand and perhaps one day to reunite with Ethan, Mia left the forest with a heavy heart but with hope that someday she would find the answers she sought. The notebook, now filled with her own notes alongside those of James Monroe and Ethan, was her guidebook, a map to a mystery that spanned generations and defied explanation. As she departed, the forest seemed to watch her go, its whispers carried on the wind, a solemn farewell, or perhaps, an invitation to return. Mia returned to the town feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The evidence gathered during the last expedition was unlike anything documented before. Dr. Green and the other specialists were busy analyzing the data, but Mia felt a personal obligation to follow a different kind of lead, the story, the emotions, and the human experiences that the scientific instruments couldn't measure. After returning to her apartment, Mia spread out all the materials they had collected on her living room floor, Ethan's notes, the recordings, the photographs, and most importantly, the notebook that had started it all. She had transcribed its contents and was now trying to piece together any clues that could hint at where Ethan might have gone or what might have happened to him. One evening, as Mia pored over the transcripts, a small, tucked-away entry in the notebook caught her eye, an entry she hadn't noticed before. It was written in the margins, almost as an afterthought by James Monroe. It mentioned a hidden grove within the forest, a place he described as the heart of their domain, where the hollow ones were strongest and most frequent. James noted that he had stumbled upon it by chance and felt both terrified and compelled by its eerie beauty and overpowering sense of sadness. Realizing the potential significance of this grove, Mia decided to return to the forest. She equipped herself with a GPS device, the transcribed notebook, and a digital recorder. Her plan was to locate this hidden grove and attempt to communicate once again with whatever forces had interacted with them during the last visit. The journey back into the forest was tense and solitary. Mia felt every shadow and every rustle of leaves more acutely, aware of how thin the veil between worlds could be in these woods. Using the coordinates she extrapolated from James's vague descriptions, she searched for the hidden grove, navigating through thick underbrush and ancient, tangled roots. After hours of searching, Mia found herself in a part of the forest she hadn't explored before. The air here was cooler, filled with a palpable charge, and the trees seemed to arch inward, as if guarding something sacred. Finally, she stepped into a clearing that took her breath away, a grove surrounded by old, majestic trees, their branches intertwined, leaves whispering secrets. In the center lay a small pond, its surface perfectly still, mirroring the canopy and the sky above. Mia felt an overwhelming sense of peace but also profound sorrow. She set up her equipment and sat by the edge of the pond. She spoke into the recorder, addressing the hollow ones directly, sharing her intentions openly. She explained her connection to Ethan, her desire to understand their realm, and her wish for harmony. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the grove, Mia felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air thickened, and a soft, almost melancholic humming filled the clearing. It was not threatening but rather seemed an acknowledgement of her presence. Mia stayed in the grove until nightfall, recording everything. When she finally left, she felt a connection to Ethan stronger than ever, as if he had been there with her, sharing in the moment. Back in town, Mia reviewed the recordings. The humming was clearly audible, and there were moments where the temperature fluctuations matched her previous experiences. But it was a series of faint, almost missed whispers that caught her attention. After enhancing the audio, she heard what sounded like a voice, Ethan's voice, mingling with the others. It was fragmented, but she could make out a few words: not lost, different existence, and no fear. This discovery was a revelation and a solace. It hinted that Ethan might have transcended into a different form of existence within the forest, one that was not bound by earthly constraints but was part of the forest itself. Armed with this new understanding, Mia dedicated herself to studying these interactions further. She published her findings and collaborated with experts in paranormal phenomena, opening a new field of study that combined folklore, environmental science, and spiritual understanding. The notebook, now almost a sacred artifact to Mia, remained her guide. It was a bridge between her world and the mysterious realm of the Hollow Ones. She continued her visits to the grove, each time feeling closer to Ethan, and each time gaining a deeper understanding of the complex, intertwined existences that the forest harbored. Mia never stopped exploring, never stopped seeking. She had found her life's work in that forest, a mission to bridge the known and the unknown. And somewhere, in the heart of those ancient woods, she knew Ethan was watching over her, no longer lost but part of something much greater, much more eternal than they had ever imagined.